Alright, let's look at square root multiplication. Here we've got a multiplication of a couple of different radicals, and we know from our square root simplification that we can sometimes simplify radicals. So the first thing we want to do is we want to simplify all radicals. Okay, that's all of them. So that means we look at each of these little radicals separately and ask ourselves if they can be simplified. So if we look at radical 75, we know that that's the same thing as radical 25 times radical 3, right? And that simplifies to equal 5 radical 3. Great. That's the first step. Well, actually, part of the first step. The other step is to check 2 radical 48. And does that simplify? Yes, it does. The 2 stays the same, but 48 is radical 16 times radical 3, right? And that equals 2 times 4 times radical 3, which equals 8 radical 3. So the first step is to simplify all radicals. And then the second step is to multiply. Here are your notes. It's pretty easy. I'll show you that step and the second step. So now what we do is we take the simplified form of each of these and multiply them together. Right? So if we look at the original problem, radical 75 times 2 radical 48, oops, that's the same thing as 5 radical 3 times 8 radical 3. Okay, as we simplify that, we know that the numbers outside the radicals multiply together, and the numbers inside the radical multiply together and stay inside the radical. So when we do 5 times 8, we get 40. And then radical 3 times radical 3 is the same thing as radical 9. Of course, radical 9 just turns into a plain 3, so that's 40 times 3, which equals 120. So there's our final answer. Let's look at another example. Alright, here in this example we've got 4 radical 32 times radical 98. Following our steps, first step, simplify each radical. So looking first at the 4 radical 32, we always ask ourselves, is there a perfect square that goes into 32? The answer is yes, 16. So we change radical 32 into radical 16 times radical 2, and of course the 4 stays. This radical 16 becomes another 4, and then the radical 2, and so that becomes 16 radical 2. There's the first radical simplified. Now let's look at the radical 98. What's the perfect square that'll go into 98? The answer is 49. And that's radical 49 times a radical 2. And of course radical 49 just becomes a 7. Radical 2 stays. So now we have the second radical simplified. If we bring those together, we have 16 radical 2 times a 7 radical 2, and that's going to equal 16 times 7 times 2, right? Because a radical 2 times a radical 2 becomes a radical 4, which equals 2, and that's where that 2 comes from. And then of course our final answer is 224. And there we have it.